Why, hello there, old sports. And in a previous video where I talked about how the Pale King's reputation seemed to have improved since the release of Silksong, I got a few comments, and by a few I mean many, I got many comments talking about how really Grandmother Silk isn't the true villain of Silksong. After some more time to both study the lore and read through some more dialogue, I agree with this assessment. Though, before we get into who I believe the true villain of Silksong is, I think it's important to clear up that Grandmother Silk is far from perfect herself, like most pale beings we know of in the series. While it can be hard to decipher Grandmother Silk's character due to her divine nature, her relationships with her many children are a good way to find out what her whole deal was. To start out by killing two birds with one stone, I don't believe that the Weavers are the true villains of Silksong, and this is partially due to their nature. They were just common Pharloom bugs that crawled around the depths of Pharloom until Grandmother Silk arrived, and as seen in the first Sinner post-fight cutscene, she somehow turns them into the Weavers we know and see in-game. Wanting to take on a motherly role, Grandmother Silk subjugated the Weavers she had created, and wanted them to love her like a mother, and I think it's important to point out that since Grandmother Silk is like a higher being, her idea of love, or her beastly nature as implied in Pharloom's Folly, may make it so her idea of love is very twisted compared to what ours is. So, she might have just wanted the Weavers to worship her, and she felt like that was a form of love. So from there, to try to escape her tyranny, the Weavers put Grandmother Silk to sleep with the ultimate end goal of killing her. We know that really the only thing that can destroy a higher being for good is the Void, and we find a weave nest down in the Abyss, which means that the Weavers were probably trying to figure out how to use it to kill her, but ultimately figured out it would probably do more damage to them. They probably figured out that even if they managed to use it to kill Grandmother Silk, they'd have to actually deal with the Void afterwards. And as we see from Hornet, that's a whole thing that needs to be done. So the Weavers probably didn't even know about the Everbloom's existence, so just figured that while the Void probably could kill Grandmother Silk, it was a box they couldn't unspring. I think it's also important to note that one of the parts needed to create the Silk Snare used to try to kill Grandmother Silk is Weaver technology, the Silk Snare from the Weave Nest. So, they probably had multiple ideas of how to try to put Grandmother Silk down, but the Weavers just didn't have all the pieces. That's why the Shamans needed to use all of the soul magic they could use to summon the Void, in combination with the Weaver technology. Both sides were missing a piece. And then to add insult to injury, once the Weavers realized they couldn't put down Grandmother Silk permanently, they decided to try and flee to Hallownest, where they eventually ended up under the subjugation of the Radiants instead. So, I mean, if you're going to be a slave, at least in Pharloom they were considered divine. So, I'm obviously not advocating for slavery, I'm just saying if you're going to lose your free will either way, at least one of the options includes you being seen as divine. Now, I think my point here is that the Weavers aren't the true villains of Pharloom, because in the end, most of their actions were they were motivated by trying to escape the grasp of Grandmother Silk. And Grandmother Silk herself, even once she fell asleep and the Weavers were gone, she was still trying to reach out through the haunting thread that would possess the bugs of Pharloom. And then adding on to that, she did the same thing she did with the Weavers, she didn't do the same thing, but my point is that she made Lace and Phantom, and Lace, from her Needlein dialogue, seems that, her whole deal is that she wants her mother to be happy, and who knows if that's from her own will, or from the will of Grandmother Silk, because that, the foggy dialogue you see when climbing up to get the third silk heart that you get after defeating Lace, says that's, better a child spun pure, a better a child loyal, better a whatever. So it's implied that Lace's whole existence, successful or not, was supposed to be as just something to comfort and support Grandmother Silk and to try to wake her up. And we see that even if Lace isn't really loyal to Grandmother Silk, she still wants to please her, and in the end is really just gets to a point where she just realizes that's not going to happen, and with some help from Hornet, and by help I mean beating some sense into her literally, she decides that at some point she's just going to let everything burn, because at this point I feel like if Grandmother Silk's own children, 2 generations of them, decide, nah, we don't want you, we don't want anything to do with you, I feel like that kind of says something about Grandmother Silk herself, even if Grandmother Silk doesn't really have dialogue, if you get what I mean. And with that, we've returned to the main question of this video, that being, who is the real villain of Hollow Knight Silksong? The Weavers were all victims to some extent. They either all died, tried to escape subjugation, failed in that by getting caught in the rule of another, or just ended up getting brought back to the mother they were trying to escape in the first place. I think the Void is more of a force of nature. It's very destructive, yes, but I don't think it really is that malicious. It just attacks anything that's alive. It's not really aiming to kill things as much as it just eats away at anything it can get its hands on, it just is. And the only kind of humanizing things about the Void come from creatures who are Void adjacent in the sense of they contain Void or are made up of Void, but also have another nature that they can pull from as well, like the Vessels, for example. And I'll admit, I was kind of hypocritical in my Pale King video, because I was kind of talking about how, as the Pale King, as like a godlike divine being, his ideas of morality are probably just completely different than ours, so it's hard to call him evil in the actions he takes. I should have extended that same grace to Grandmother Silk as well, especially considering half the things I complained about her doing in that video weren't actually her doing. They were the people below her that were doing that. And that leads us into my main point. Who are the real villains of Hollow Knight Silksong? None other than the conductors. According to the last living conductor, Ballador, and a rune harp we can find, it's implied that the Weavers, running out of options and desperate for any way out, they were convinced by the conductors to give them rule over Pharloom and over Grandmother Silk in a sense, or her sleeping condition, I mean. Because Conductor Ballador says that, "Is our state so bare, pilgrim? By the will of the conductors, we once boomed, and this citadel shook at our decree, but the words, how hollow they echoed. The mantle of rule, claimed greedily from Pharloom's fading first children, those bitter weavers, it was yoke, not crown." I feel like that's meaning to say, or at least in my interpretation, that they were desperate for control, and the Weavers were like, well, I mean, we're gonna leave this place anyway, might as well give it to someone. And then from there, that's when things kind of started to go to shit, because the conductors, they knew they probably needed to keep Grandmother Silk asleep, because from their point of view, if the Weavers, Grandmother Silk's children, were trying to keep her asleep, it was probably for a good reason, if not a very dangerous one, or a good reason that had some danger looming behind it. All of the Weavers used their silk to play songs to keep Grandmother Silk asleep. And that's the thing, they were the ones doing it. They were the ones assigned to do it, and they were the ones in charge of it, and they were the ones doing it. It was all them. It was a contained system for the Weavers. Now, they were made to do that by Grandmother Silk, so in that case, it's Grandmother Silk's fault. But after she was put asleep, the Weavers continued to play their songs in an attempt to keep their mother asleep, especially considering she was probably not very happy about being put to sleep in the first place. So, the conductors formed the Choir, a system and just faction of bugs that were unknowingly keeping Grandmother Silk asleep while they worked on another solution to the problem, that being the Architects. Once the Architects were constructed, they could start building their systems and machines to endlessly spew out songs to keep the Grandmother asleep for all eternity, or at least that was the goal. And once they were completed, the bugs that had toiled to form the Choir, or to make up the Choir, were allowed to exist in the lap of luxury, at least as much as the Citadel could provide. But those resources had to come from somewhere. Those machines had to be powered somehow. And that's where we get to the Underworks. The Underworks are quite literally the dark underbelly of the Holy Citadel, with the upper shining Citadel having plenty of light and natural light, and song and all these good things, and luxury and bathhouses and all these things that can provide for people. The Underworks did not have any of that. It's dark, the only light coming from the boiling magma, or the dim light bulbs affixed around the place. While at least the Weavers knew they were playing their songs to appease their god and their mother, the workers in the Underworks have no idea why they're even working on the things they do. Their whole purpose has been reduced to just keeping these machines running for the sake of keeping the Citadel happy, and for the greater goal of keeping Grandmother Silk content. Even worse, the conductors have convinced the underworker bugs that if they just toil for long enough and suffer long enough, they will earn the divine right to ascend into the Citadel. But that day will never come, because as we can see, they've left pre-recorded messages that are just meant to say, hey, get back to work. Benches are required to be paid for, even just to sit down a little bit. And as we see from Loam, having the amount of effort you need to put in to earn a single rosary is absurd. So honestly, this isn't really funny. It's more funny in a dark way, where it's like half the money you make by doing your job just goes into keeping yourself alive, which I guess that's just how normal society is. But that's not a good thing. And we see that the conductors feel no shame or regret for this, as we see from the conductor we get to talk to in getting the threefold melody, or his piece of the threefold melody. We learn that they have come to regret how things have become, but only in the sense that they couldn't keep this act up forever, and eventually things were slowly getting worse because it was harder and harder to keep Grandmother Silk contained. But at the end, they don't even really regret what they did to the underworkers. It was mostly just a thing of, oh, well, now that's affecting me, I realize how bad this is. It's like, yeah, maybe you should have realized that when you had to employ slave labor. Sorry. It's pretty easy to tell that faith and motherhood are two very important themes of Silksong. And while I have seen some people kind of simplify the game down to, oh, religion bad, I think that's kind of doing a disservice to the narrative being told here. I think religion can be bad, and I think lots of religions are bad. I won't lie about that. But I think the idea here is that the religion, or the faith itself, or the divine itself, isn't necessarily inherently harmful. It's the people, the mortal bugs or mortal men, who come to become in charge of that system, or who come to interpret it and make those rules. It's like a game of telephone. It gets more distorted the more it goes on, and humans will use any excuse they can get sometimes, or certain types of people, rather, will use any excuse they can get to try to certify, or to try to make themselves more comfortable, even if it has to come at the expense of another group entirely. Also, I almost forgot to mention this, but even not taking the underworks into account, the White Wards were extremely horrifying, and I don't even know why they did that. Or I do. It was another selfish thing that the conductors were trying to do. They were trying to use silk to sustain their own lives, as we see with the conductor we talked to in Silksong. He has this little silk machine that's kind of like funneling silk into his little bedchamber, and we see that once Act 3 happens and everything starts crumbling, it gets crushed, and that's what ultimately causes his own death. The Unraveled boss we also find in the White Ward also probably has something to do with this, considering the shell, quote-unquote, that's used as a body by the Silk Regs is the same one that we see the other conductors have. So it's probably just an experiment that went wrong, and even though they knew what could happen, they still underwent the risk anyways, because they just wanted to hold on to their power a little longer. And hell, while I'm mentioning things I almost forgot to mention, it's really heavily implied that the Citadel is the reason Bilewater is as toxic as it is, quite literally and figuratively, and they were also the ones that destroyed Virginia. And while I know the Green Prince's dialogue, with the Green Prince before you fight the Clover Dancers, Hornet mentions that beneath a pale being, devotion or destruction were the only fates they had. I think it's important to say that I don't think the Grandmother Silk was directly destroying Virginia, or threatening to destroy Virginia, because the reason the Clockwork Dancers exist, or the Cogwork Dancers, my bad, is because the Prince, or the Green Prince's lover, gave up his body and soul to become that in exchange for their safety for a little while longer. And I don't see why Grandmother Silk would have any use for that, but I could see why the Citadel and the conductors might. I think it's very possible that what Hornet means in her voice, or in her dialogue lines there, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that Grandmother Silk was directly destroying Virginia. It was that their only options were either to be destroyed by the Citadel, who were motivated by trying to keep Grandmother Silk asleep, or they would help continue the perpetuation of Grandmother Silk's slumber, if that makes any sense. So I guess my point here is that if you needed a reason to hate the conductors, technically they're the reason the Green Prince's lover died. So that makes them canonically homophobic. Wow, a religious leader being homophobic? I could never imagine it. No, but in all seriousness, I would like to reiterate that I think that the real problem isn't necessarily the divine, because Grandmother Silk and her pale kin their ideas of morality and their thoughts are so above, or just maybe different is a better word. They're so different than mortal bugs that it's hard to hold both mortal bugs and the divine to a same standard. And the Weavers were just normal like primitive bugs that were enhanced and evolved by Grandmother Silk to act as her children against their will, so they never really had a choice. Their whole lives were just trying to escape something they had no chance of overpowering. But the conductors were given power, or at least to them it seemed like power. But instead of just working themselves to try to keep Grandmother Silk asleep, or just letting her wake up and seeing whatever consequences came of that, they forced bugs, other kin, to work for them. They subjugated them just as Grandmother Silk had subjugated the Weavers. Because in a world where you have concrete proof that God exists, saying that, hey, God is going to be angry at you if you don't do this, that's probably one of the ultimate trump cards you have in terms of motivating people to do things for you. And if the bugs in the Citadel truly believed that the conductors could communicate with the divine in some way, then of course they'd listen to them. I think the lesson we can learn from the conductors is that power corrupts, and having too much blind faith in something can only lead you down a dark path, even if the intentions start out noble. And hell, we don't even know if that's the case. We don't even know if the conductors were ever noble. Things could have been broken from the start, for all we know. Thank you all for watching this video. I know this is a little bit different than what I do, but I like doing these kind of like lore discussion videos, especially since Mossbag is probably busy at work toiling away in the editing and writing dungeons trying to create his Silksong lore video for us. So I'm having fun just trying to put the lore together myself before Mossbag comes out and people start yelling at me because he came up with an interpretation that people are only gonna... sorry, I'm kind of going off script here. I worry that I'm gonna get a lot of influx, or I'm gonna get an influx of negative comments on my previous lore video, or even this one once Mossbag makes a video on his, because he's probably going to come to different conclusions, and people are going to blindly follow whatever he says, which I think is kind of ironic considering the message I was just trying to talk about here. So that's going to be fun when that eventually happens, but I'm excited to see what Mossbag makes. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you have anything you'd like me to know, please comment down below. I have a Patreon and YouTube memberships if you are really interested in my videos and would want to support me, but of course there's no pressure, and just watching these videos is more than enough and means the world to me. I hope you all have a good day, and good night.